Hey everybody, this is Siren, and I'm going to do something which I feel is kind of unique as far as banlist takes go. What I'm going to be doing is talking about the erratas and how they will impact the future of the metagame, and if the game is going to turn into a more healthy state, or if I think it will turn into a more negative state. Negative not being necessarily that the game is going to go down a poor rabbit hole, but more that we'll have a more overwhelming meta than we had previously. So, we just got our February, banlist announcement. We got it a little ahead of time for Worlds. And so we've got 5 cards on the ban list, right? Not ban list, but errata list. Bertolt Hoover, Living Weapon, Disarming Glance, Mimic, Knots Flask, and Recovery Girl. Starting with Bertolt, he already had a pretty great enhance. Draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards if they are of the same type. This attack gets +2 or -2 damage, right? And then he can transform at 9 or more foundations. And that was where the big issue was Bertolt was able to just continually draw through his deck, and the discarding was never really a cost because of cards like Feral Shriek and Wishheart. So, now we have Enhanced. Draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. If the discarded cards are the same type, this attack gets +2 damage. Me personally, I don't feel this is going to negatively impact Bertolt very much. I think the biggest thing with Bertolt was he was able to steamroll on turn 2 very easily with things like Combined Firepower, and especially with the fire list we saw, that -2 damage, we do not want to make it to that -2 damage. We want to be killing on turn 2. I think it impacts his survivability, and it impacts his ability to play offensive foundations, but under the death and fire symbols, there are plenty of defensive foundations he can still play, even with set rotation coming up. His response was also changed. At the start of the end-phase transform, each player chooses 3 foundations in their stage and sacrifices the rest. Only playable player has 11 or more foundations. Again, I don't think this is a very big change for Bertolt. I think the only time this was happening was in drawn-out games against defensive-heavy decks, or against decks that really needed their foundation count. It is kind of interesting to see that one of the Titan Shifters has been altered, but personally, I think Ymir deserved this more than anyone because of the fact Ymir can essentially transform on turn 2 very easily, right? We've all seen it happen. Ymir can just go, I'll build out my hand, I'll build a new training method with my form, cool, I'm transformed and you're gonna die, right? So I definitely don't think Bertolt deserved that part of the change. I think that would have just pushed people to play a longer game with Bertolt, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. Especially since it's got that we've lost that -2 damage. I think leaving it at 9 and only altering a Ymir would have been a lot better for the game. But regardless, I don't think this errata is going to impact the difference game in a lot. I think Bertolt's going to stay in a relatively safe position. Maybe a few minor changes in deck building, but I don't think he's going to lose a ton. Moving on, we have Disarming Glance, a personal favorite card. Old. Response flip. After an attack is played, players cannot play abilities that add cards to their hand until after it resolves. And then new. Response flip. After an attack is played, players cannot play abilities that add cards to their hand during this attack. Now, at first glance, these seem very similar wording, right? They just seem like clarifications. But there was actually a tech using Cape of No Return or any other kind of card that removes the attack before it can resolve, where it meant that the player could not add cards to their hand for the remainder of the turn. What this meant was that characters like Bertolt and Pony were not able to draw their whole deck and just sling a million moves at you. And while it's not necessarily the most fair plan, I think it was a needed piece of tech that offered interaction against those decks where it lacked somewhere else, especially with other things that got touched on the ban list. And like, for instance, Pony was a death by 1,000 cuts. Well, this was a part of the way to stop those 1,000 cuts. But with Bertolt not having the -2 damage anymore, we've lost that ability to stay minus. We've lost that ability to just get rid of the cuts, and now we've also lost the ability to get rid of the 1,000 cuts, right? It's definitely going to be an interesting thing to see if this card is still played, because I don't personally think it will be, because a opponent can just say, okay, I won't draw on this turn, I'll just do it on my next one, right? So I think unless you time it very well on something like an Electric Moth or something like that, this card's not going to see very much play anymore, but I do think it's still a very neat card, and I think it could come back in the future. Moving on, we have Mimic, a personal deck that I've recently picked up. We've got Old. Response. Once per turn. After you check an asset, add 1 attack with a check value of 3 from your discard pile to your hand. And then new. Response Commit. After you check an asset, add 1 attack with a check value of 3 from your discard pile to your hand. the key thing here is we've added a commit cost to him instead of it being once per turn, which is really interesting. So if we find ways to re-ready Mimic, we can then repeat that. But even without that, I don't think this is impacting the deck a ton. Mimic is still going to go... Different Mimic builds will do different things, obviously, but City Rampage Mimic is still going to sling a bunch of moves at you on turn 2 and give everything plus 3 damage or whatever. I don't think this is going to kill the deck in a major way. I think it will definitely see it drop down to a more fair level, and that will probably turn people off of it for, you know, worlds or things like that. But I don't think this is going to completely stop the deck from being playable or even stop the deck from being competitive at a locals level, right? I think it could still very easily win an LCQ when piloted by a correct player, but it's going to come down to a lot more of, I need to think, do I want to pick that up or do I want the stat buffs on this, right? As for the meta and how this is going to impact the state of the game, I think this is an ultimately good shift. I think moving it to a more, not brain heavy, I suppose, or thought heavy process on deciding when you use that response versus, oh, I checked an asset, let me go pick it up just because I have the free thing, right? And it also plays this weird counterplay of, after I commit the asset, I no longer am getting that damage or damage buff for minus, right? So we then have to consider, is the card that we want to pick up more important or the stat buffs themselves, right? Or the stat buff or debuff. I think it's a very good thing for Mimic. I think it's going to make the deck a lot healthier and a lot more fair to people's eyes. But I think the next card on the list, Knots Flask, definitely hurt Mimic a lot more. So, old card had no keywords, new card has the unique keyword. This unfortunately means you can only build in 1 copy of Knots Flask per while it's on the field. And with the lack of being able to just pop, destroy an asset, it's definitely going to mean that you are keeping that 1 Knots Flask, which... I'm torn on this card. I think this was more of a Mimic hit than anything. I don't think this was a specifically, we wanted to just touch Knots Flask. I think this was more of a, we wanted to touch Mimic, and this was the easiest way to touch Mimic without completely altering Mimic as a character. Because now Mimic's not saying plus 5 damage or minus 4 damage multiple times in a turn. We're saying it once per turn, and potentially we're going to be losing speed out on it, right? For other decks, though, and for the state of the game, I have mixed opinions on it, but I do think this is overall healthy for the game. I think damage reduction is a very bad thing for the game, and I think not being able to... And I think being able to, like, hey, I'm going to target and commit that 1. Alright, cool. I don't have to deal with that for my turn. Like with the Vast Hybrid Chimera Kraken or something. I think that's a very good thing for the game. I think it's a great thing that we can just go, I'll target, commit that 1 Knots Flask. You're not going to be using it, and I'll be able to play my turn as I wish, right? One thing to note is it is going to impact some mill decks like Rhina 2, because we were playing this for the mill 3 because it just lets you mill more cards. So when you had transformed, you were still able to mill 3 and get your next removal, right? If you got transformed early or something had happened, like you had cycled and your discard pile was empty, this lets you access your remove 3, which was really important for the deck. But I think overall the deck will be able to shift and maneuver in a way that it doesn't matter too much for the deck. I think overall, Knots Flask getting this unique keyword, while it's not my favorite thing, I think it's the best choice that we could have had. And then for our last one, we have Recovery Girl. I don't want to say menace, but I don't think anyone particularly likes this deck outside of a very few select people. Corey Nelson comes to mind, but this deck is definitely one of those stall decks. Our old response was, after you take damage, build a foundation from your discard pile. And then our new response is, after you take damage, build a foundation from your discard pile, committed, right? So we saw this during Nationals. We were responding with a copy of Last Second Rescue, gaining back the health, and then Recovery Girl will respond, build back in the copy of Last Second Rescue, and then we'll respond with Last Second Rescue again. So we're back up to 30 health and you can't do anything. Okay, cool. I'm going to continually just live until you can't play the game and just keep playing throws to chip you down, right? It leads to an uninteractive and unfun gameplay style that overall just isn't very healthy for the game. I think this is definitely going to be a good meta shift, and it's going to be a good maneuver and tilt into more of a interactive game, hopefully. But it almost feels too little too late for the state of the game. I feel like she's wreaked her havoc. She'll go to Worlds potentially still on those very determined players. I think she can still do the thing. But I think that it's too little too late for Recovery Girl. She's going to get rotated in a few months. This overall isn't going to massively impact the game past Worlds, and therefore it's not going to be something we see for a very long time. Maybe in MHA Spotlight this will get seen a little bit, but I think that this is just too little too late. But for the health of the game, I think it was important, and especially for Worlds where we're doing stream matches, I think it was important. Now, as for what I wanted to see on the ban list, this is just the top 8. Let's just take a look. So we can look and see 1 deck, 2 decks, 3 decks, 4 decks, 5 decks, 6 decks, 7 decks. I believe we're all running Knots Flask. I want to say all of these, yeah. All of the Mimics decks were running Knot Flask, so it was definitely more of a Mimic kit than anything. We weren't overly concerned about anything other than Mimic. There we go. But yeah, we weren't overly concerned about a deck other than Mimic with Knots Flask, in my opinion. I think that Knots Flask, if it was just simply, I don't want to say not make it a committal cost, but make it so Mimic couldn't interact with it other than Unique, I think the card still would have been okay. I don't think it would have needed to be banned yet. Or not banned, but errata to be a Unique. But I definitely think Mimic pushed that card to where we needed it to be Unique, personally. As for cards I wanted to see on the ban list, let's just go ahead. One that immediately springs to my mind is Battle Aura Release. This is the definition of a staple card. If you are running Death, Earth, or Water, you should be running this card unless you're playing some weird strategy. It's a free draw card. It pumps itself up, and it plays into the best card on 2 of its symbols, Falling Skies, or one of the best cards at the very least. I think that this card needed to be touched in some way along with a few others, but overall for the health of the game, I think this errata list was a good choice. I think there are still some cards, things like Vast Hybrid Chimera Kraken, Walk the Dog, Battle Aura, like I said, Falling Skies, Ice Sword Execution. They all promote a uninteractive gameplay design. Oh, and City Rampage and Combined Firepower should have been touched, but that's neither here nor there for this list. They're all things that lead to unfun gameplay and unfun interactions because they almost make it like you're playing solitaire, and that's not what we want with a trading card game, right? We want to play with our opponent and experience games with our opponent. We don't want to just sit and play solitaire for however long. And even as somebody who's currently, I'm playing a lot of City Rampage decks and a lot of Combined Firepower decks, I will still be the first person to say these cards should not still be legal because they are promoting unfun gameplay mechanics, right? City Rampage is making it so we're doing turn 2 kills super easy. Combined Firepower is cheating out blocks. It's cheating out a ton of damage for characters. It's profiting from cards that were originally, hey, you're removing this. This is not going to be in the game anymore. It's kind of a heavy cost, right? That was always the thing with remove cost cards. It was always a heavy cost because you weren't getting anything back. Typically, it was just a gone card, and you couldn't repeat that. And Combined Firepower was like, well, actually, you're going to get a bunch of damage or potentially a free block card off of this without actually drawing cards, right? So I think those are a couple things that still need to be touched for the state of the game. But overall, I think the game is in a fairly healthy spot. I think we're at the point of if everything's busted, nothing's busted, sort of like the Marvel Rivals philosophy, right? If every character is stupid good, is anyone really stupid good at that point? And while, yes, it is, as Travis mentioned, we're making a lot of degenerate plays. People are doing very stupid things with their decks, like outrageously stupid. But I think for where we're at in the game, I think it's the only point we can pivot to without a massive just nuke ban list type of situation, right? We would need that nuke ban list of we're going to hit Walk the Dogs, Chimera Kraken, City Rampage, Electric Moth, Battle Aura Release, Falling Skies, Deception Dagger, Combined Firepower, all of those cards, right? And plenty more. Ice Sword Executioner is another one, but Mitts of Despair even too, right? Like we would need to hit all of these cards in order to create that nuke ban list, that original like MHA set 1, set 2, set 3, set 4 sort of meta where we kind of anything could win, but it was very much a heavy pilot. And I think even now anything can win, but you have to be a dedicated pilot. And players like Travis Tangeman and clicking here, players like Travis and Clinton Thomas, they both prove that. Characters like Edshot and Krista are people no one expected to come to Nats and do well, and they came 1st and 6th, right? It's absolute proof that as long as you are playing correctly and you know what you're doing as a player, you can make it with any deck. It's just going to be a bit harder than something like Bertolt or Pony, right? It's going to be a harder match, but it's going to be more rewarding in a sense, because you're still able to do stupid busted things because you're under these symbols, but it's not just running through the same things, right? Like this Krista deck, right? We weren't playing City Rampage, we weren't doing anything like that. The main thing with this deck was we were looping Runaway and looping and Wound Restore to reheal from the Runaways, right? So Krista was just gonna, okay, I'll live until I have all my pieces. I'll draw a bajillion cards with Walmarie's Might whenever I feel like it. And we'll just sit here and we'll just hold off and we'll wait and we'll wait and we'll wait until it's time to kick out, right? This Edge Shot deck, right? It's a very much a string out Death by 1,000 Cuts deck. But it's playing cards like Titan Cliff, where we're not only going to be able to fix our hand or something like that, we're also going to be able to get our stat buffs, and we're going to get stat buffs in a way that aren't really interactable as easily. Things like almost fired effect, stat buffs, right? Speed and damage, and then we're getting minus difficulty and minus to our block mods. Minusing your block mod is something that's not really interactable. We're not minusing their speed, we're simply minusing our block mod, and those can go negative. And we're playing a card like Thousand Sheep Pierce, which is really good to give our things flash, so we can play something like a Teaming with the Attack Titan. It's got, +5/+5 potentially, and we've made it flash. You can't interact with it. Here's a 10 mid for 10 catch, right? But overall, I think the state of the game is at a fairly healthy point. I don't think it's going to drastically change with Critical Role either. Outside of a couple of cards, which are just profiting off of cards that are already needing to be touched and messed with, right? I think that we are at the point of, if we try and fix the game to a state of fair and balanced, quote unquote, it's almost too hard without just doing that solid nuke list, right? Because if we don't do that solid nuke list, something will live, and that's something I'm also worried about with rotation coming. But that's a talk for another time. But this is my take on the ban list. This is how I think the state of the game is going. And UVS, sponsor me still, maybe? I know. I just talk bad. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have a good time with the ban list. Bye-bye.